It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the OSD on-screen display menu system of the ASUS ROG OLED PG49WCD. The OSD is controlled by a central joystick. It's actually at the back of the monitor, just at the bottom. There are also two accompanying buttons. There's a dedicated power button to the right as you view from the front, and also a little shortcut key which you can customize to the left. Speaking of the shortcut system, if you press the joystick up, you press it to the right, you press it down, or you press that little button to the right. They're all your shortcut keys. You've got 4 different shortcut keys. You can configure them in My Favorite in the OSD under Shortcut. So you can see you've got the right, up, down, and the button to the left. I do apologise if I said the button to the right. I meant the left. The button to the right is actually the power button. So various different options you can see here. And Customize Setting 1 and Customize Setting 2. That means you can set up the OSD exactly how you want in 2 different ways and then quickly load them with the shortcut keys if you wish. So you can see there there's Save and Load for Setting 1 and Setting 2 as well. But the shortcut allows you to quickly load these settings. Before going through the menu itself, I'm going to address the question, what are the best settings for this monitor? And by best settings, what I really mean are the test settings I use in my review. So they're applicable to my unit, they suit my preferences, and also the colorimetric targets which I go for in my reviews. Individual units and preferences do vary. So I do like to have variable refresh rate on, and in the OSD, if you see things with this little button like that, if it's red and it's to the right, that means it's on. Whereas if it's to the left and it's grey rather than highlighted in red, that means the setting is disabled. So variable refresh rate allows you to use adaptive sync. It's basically your adaptive sync toggle, so it allows you to use FreeSync Premium Pro G-Sync compatible. You can also use G-Sync compatible via HDMI 2.1 VRR and use HDMI 2.1 VRR. I'm not entirely sure if you actually need variable refresh rate enabled in the OSD. I haven't specifically tested that out and I don't have HDMI hooked up at the moment. So I'm not sure if you need variable refresh rate active if you want to use HDMI 2.1 VRR, but even if you're not actually using VRR, you can still have variable refresh rate active in the OSD. The other thing you'd have to be paying attention to are, of course, the presets, game visual. Racing mode is the default, and that's just fine. I was happy to just use that. The other settings, they make various different changes. So scenery mode is highly oversaturated. You can use these presets and then make other adjustments, but some of the adjustments it makes can't be counteracted in the OSD. So as I said, it looks very oversaturated, but the 6-axis saturation control is actually all at 50. You can reduce this a bit to sort of offset it, but really there's no point. If you're going to be doing that, you might as well use a different preset. And there's cinema mode, which is more of the same really, actually very oversaturated. Appears to have a bit of a cool tint. Well, that could just be the amount of blue on my desktop wallpaper, which is massively oversaturated in this particular setting. RTS RPG, that has a warmer look to it, but seems to be very oversaturated. So yes, cinema does look very cool compared to RTS RPG, and I don't mean cool in a good way, I mean cool as in high white point. FPS mode really flooded, also very saturated, but this is designed to give you a competitive edge, so you might find that useful if you like how it looks, and you can make further adjustments. So using FPS mode, you can adjust the saturation to your taste as well to some extent. And the shadow boost, which is set to level 3 with this setting by default, but you can adjust that if you wish. There's sRG calibration mode. I wouldn't recommend using this, although it is called sRGB calibration mode. That's actually quite locked down. There's another sRGB setting which is actually a little bit more accurate, or it was on my unit, and you can use that with any of the other presets. I'd recommend racing mode, and that allows you to adjust things like the brightness and the color channels, as well as the gamma, so you get good flexibility. Actually get the same flexibility as you do with the other settings. So if you go to color, display color space, you can change this to sRGB if you want, and that is an effective sRGB emulation setting, so that gives more as the developers intend look, more muted saturation levels. And when I say as the developers intend, it's because most content is designed with the sRGB color space in mind when you're using the monitor under SDR. Under HDR, none of this applies, and you can't actually change the setting anyway, so don't worry about that. So wide gamut if you want the highest level of vibrancy and saturation, sRGB if you want that more toned down as the developers intend look, DCI-P3, that's somewhere between those two. With DCI-P3, just be aware that you will need to set the color temperature to one of the predefined settings. If you have it set to user, then it actually just goes to an sRGB emulation mode, even though it says DCI-P3. But if you select something else, for example 6500K, then it actually is DCI-P3 emulating. But because of how I like to test monitors, I like to stick to wide gamut to show the full capabilities and what things will look like with the full gamut. And then I export sRGB separately, but of course, according to your own preferences, you may prefer using one or the other most of the time. And be aware that this is applied universally, so it doesn't apply just to specific presets. So if you wanted sRGB for some games, for example, and wide gamut for others, then you would have to use that load thing, the save and load feature for the shortcut keys, which I showed you earlier, at least in the full OSD video I showed you earlier. So just a quick reminder, my favorite customized settings. You can have setting 1 and setting 2. You can have sRGB and wide gamut, for example. And you can then assign shortcut keys to quickly load setting 1 and setting 2. So that would be how you'd switch between the two different gamut settings easily. So I've got variable refresh rate on. I've got it set to the default wide gamut mode. Most of the other settings I did leave at default, and even brightness I actually left at default because it happened to get around 160 nits on my unit, which is what I go for in my reviews when I'm calibrating, and I go for that for consistency. It's just what I've done for a long time. It suits most of the lighting conditions in which I use monitors. But of course you want to be setting this according to your own preferences. And a very important setting associated with this is uniform brightness. If you have this disabled, then the monitor will vary its brightness according to the content being displayed, and it will generally dim when there's brighter content or more bright content on the screen, and it will get brighter when there's less bright content on the screen, so there's largely dark content on the screen. If you have uniform brightness enabled, then it's much more consistent, but it will cap your brightness. As I measured in the review, it's around 260 nits with uniform brightness on, so that's actually perfectly fine for most people. But if you're someone who does like really bright monitors under SDR, then you might want to turn uniform brightness off, but you might find the lack of consistency annoying. The only other thing I changed was a very slight change to the color channels. So it's set to user by default in racing mode, and everything is set to 100, red, green, and blue. I just nudged down blue one notch to 99. Again, that worked on my unit. It's not going to be the same on all units. So by all means, try this. So really, that's what I did. I just enabled uniform brightness and I slightly changed the blue color channel. I realized I missed off a few presets, so I'll just quickly talk about them. I don't consider them best settings by any means, but it's worth going through them anyway, just for completeness. So the other one's MOBA mode, which gives a very funky look. It just highlights certain shades. You can kind of see oranges and some green shades. I don't play MOBAs myself. I don't know if this is advantageous, this kind of look. So just as a reminder, this is what it looks like normally. In MOBA mode, it looks like that. And then there's user mode, and this is really quite similar to racing mode by default, but there are a few extra options which you can configure. I believe it's 6-axis saturation, which is available here, but not in racing mode. I'll just quickly check for you. So Vivid Pixel isn't available in racing mode, but it is in user, and 6-axis saturation. I've now switched over to HDR, so I can talk about the HDR settings. Quite a lot of the menu is grayed out under HDR. The uniform brightness setting looks like it isn't grayed out or it's available, but it doesn't actually do anything under HDR. But HDR setting, that's the main one. By default, it's set to console HDR. The setting you want to use could well depend on your device. If you're using a games console, of course, try console HDR. On the PC though, on the games I tested, so I'm using Tomb Raider at the moment, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, things don't look right at all using the console HDR setting. Annoyingly, it's not being picked up properly on the camera. To the eye, the light up there, it has this very, very odd saturated yellow and orange look to it. Don't know why it doesn't appear at all like that on the video. And the glint of light there on the water surface, that appears with a very saturated, far too saturated red outer rim and then an orange rim just inside of that. Again, not sure why it's not captured at all properly on the video. It's just something that the camera's not sensitive to or isn't picking up. And it didn't matter how I calibrated the HDR setting in the game either. So my preference, at least on my unit and with the PC games I was playing, this also worked well for HDR video content, incidentally, that I looked at on the PC. Gaming HDR. In terms of the brightness capability, it's actually the same regardless of which setting you set here, except for Display HDR 400 True Black. So what that will do is that will limit the brightness and it will stop the automatic brightness limiter kicking in so heavily. So it will give you a more consistent experience, but it will cap your brightness. If you prefer that, then by all means use that setting. But I would recommend you just try all of the settings and see which one you prefer. So I prefer gaming HDR. Cinema HDR is not too different to this. It just tends to be a little bit dimmer overall. Some of the bright shades seem to be toned down a bit, but the brightest shades are still very bright, and as I said, the peak luminance doesn't change. So I don't know why the console HDR mode looks so funky and why it's not captured at all in the video, but never mind. The other setting is brightness adjustable. As it says there, HDR PQ curve will be affected when the brightness adjustment is on under HDR mode. And this is correct. So I've selected brightness adjustable, and you can use this with any of the other HDR settings. So I'm using it with gaming HDR now, but it works in much the same way regardless. Brightness, if you reduce that, it kind of dulls the image. If you reduce it a lot, it's quite an obvious effect that it affects shades which shouldn't be affected, so it drags down a lot of the medium shades so they're too dull. It doesn't just cap the brightness. If you want to cap the brightness, again, I'd recommend the HDR 400 True Black setting. But if you need to adjust this a little bit because you're finding it uncomfortable, then of course viewing comfort always takes priority, so do feel free to adjust this. So yep, that's all I did under HDR. I just changed over to the gaming HDR setting. There's a final thing to note that you can use variable refresh rate under HDR. That isn't a problem on this monitor. Back to SDR, onto the remaining settings now. So there's Game Plus, FPS Counter. You can have a number or a bar graph. That's displayed at the top right. Yes, this is a very wide monitor. I have to move the tripod quite far to show you that. 144 Hertz. So if you're using variable refresh rate, this will change according to the frame rate of your content in a VRR environment when it's in its VRR range. So between 48 and 144 frames a second it should show, more or less. So I've got the NVIDIA Pendulum demo running now. You can see that changing, and that changes in accordance to the frame rate. Although when it goes below the floor of operation, between 48 and 55 frames a second, depending on the fluctuations occurring, then it will actually show a multiple of the frame rate with this refresh rate because LFC, low frame rate compensation, is kicked in. So it's not always a reliable indication of your frame rate. But as long as your frame rate is consistently higher than 55 frames a second, then it will be showing your frame rate. Unless you've got VRR disabled, and then it will just show you the static refresh rate that you've selected for the display. And the bar graph feature gives you a little bit of history for the frame rate as well. Next you've got Crosshair. A few different designs. You can either have light blue or green. There's a little dot, a very little cross, or a somewhat larger but still actually quite small cross. I know not everyone loves the ASUS Crosshair designs, and I understand why. They are quite small, not always very visible. They are completely opaque though. They're not semi-transparent or anything like that. The only way you can make them a little bit more visible, because it does depend on the background shade, you can enable dynamic crosshair. So you can still select the design if you want a small dot or a smaller cross. I'm going to use the larger cross just so it's a bit more visible in the video. You see it's now changed to red, so it's more visible. Now it's gone blue or light blue. It varies different shades to just try and contrast with whatever's in the background. Unlike on Gigabyte models, you can't customize your own crosshairs and upload them to the monitor. You can adjust the position of the crosshair though by using the joystick, so it doesn't need to be in the center of the screen. If you then want to return it to the center of the screen, it appears you have to do it manually, and it can be difficult to know where the center of the screen is, but if you do a factory reset of the monitor, it'll be right in the middle of the screen. But I don't use the feature, so I don't really care, but that could be a bit annoying if you accidentally move it. There should be a reset crosshair position feature, unless I'm missing it. There doesn't appear to be one of those. Next you've got Sniper, and this puts a little box in the middle of the screen. You can see my mouse cursor enlarges when I go into the box. So you can have 1.2x, 1.5x, or 2x, and you can have a green or blue dot to show you the center. I've changed my wallpaper to something where the box itself is clearer, so you can see that is the size of the box. You can use most of these Game Plus features under HDR as well, by the way, except for the Sniper feature. That's going to be grayed out under HDR. Timer, so you can have a timer displayed on the screen which counts down from your selected value, and you can adjust the position of that using the joystick. And again, I think there should be a reset position option, but you can just do a factory reset of the OSD if you need to. And there's also a countdown from 40 minutes, 50 minutes, 60 minutes, or 90 minutes. There's a stopwatch feature which will count up, and now I know I'm just going to adjust the position of that so you can see it without me adjusting the tripod. And actually, come to think of it, because it was initially in the top left, it's quite easy to get it back there. But for the crosshair, it is more difficult to know exactly where the center of the screen is, so that would have been useful. And you might want more than one thing active at the same time. You might want an FPS graph, and you might want a crosshair, but unfortunately you can't do that. You can only have one of these Game Plus features active at once. And again, that's more limited than Gigabyte models. Gigabyte monitors allow you to stack these options if you wish. Although having said that, I can see that some of these are toggleable, so you could probably have an FPS counter and the stopwatch at the same time, or it looks like you should be able to, but you can't. That's just killed my FPS counter. And the stopwatch has appeared. Next you've got Game Visual, which I've been through, Shadow Boost, which I haven't been through. So I've got Legom's black level test open, legom.nl, the website. Just show you what Shadow Boost does. If you select level 1, it enhances the depth of darker shades. Level 2 does that more, level 3 does that more. However, you might notice, you can't really see exactly what these look like to the eye on the video, by the way. The differences are a bit more subtle than on some settings of this type. It doesn't affect the black depth, thankfully, which is a nice thing, especially on an OLED like this. You don't really want to be affecting the black depth. But it seems to have more of an effect on the medium dark shades than the particularly dark shades. So the top row there is only really changed significantly. It's changed a little bit actually by level 3. It's somewhat more visible, but dynamic adjustment, that's supposed to look at the content and then adjust according to that. This makes more pronounced adjustments. So for competitive edge, I would recommend dynamic adjustment if that's the kind of thing you like. But be aware that it doesn't just affect the dark shades. It does affect a lot of medium shades as well. So does level 1, 2, 3. So it's not just the very dark shades. It could be more selective, this setting, and I personally would prefer it is. I also prefer more of a granular adjustment than these sort of steps up. But the setting's there if you wish to use it, and as I said, for a competitive edge, that's really what this is designed for. Dynamic adjustment will hopefully do the trick. So in the image section, brightness, uniform brightness, contrast, that's the usual control between 0 and 100. 80 is the default, certainly is in racing mode as well. I would leave it there. Vivid pixel and HDR setting. Well, I've shown you HDR settings. They're only applicable to HDR. Vivid pixel is only available, as I showed you, in certain presets, and that does not include racing mode. So if I select user, I'll be able to adjust that and talk a little bit about that. So it's set to 50 by default, but this is basically a sharpness filter. So if you want to increase the sharpness a bit, you can increase the vivid pixel setting. If you want things to have a softer look, you can decrease it. As far as sharpness algorithms go, this one's fairly gentle, which is a good thing actually. So it doesn't have a completely artificial look, even if you boost this all the way up to 100. I mean, I can see that things are over sharpened, but it doesn't look as weird and sort of artifacty as some sharpness filters can. Next, there's aspect control. 32 by 9, that's the native aspect ratio of the monitor. There is full, which will allow all of the pixels to be used. And there's pixel by pixel, which is a pixel mapping feature, one-to-one pixel mapping. For the native resolution, that will be the same. But if you happen to select a different 32 by 9 resolution, or you've created a custom resolution, I suppose this could be different. A 16 by 9 fill up will fill the screen up. And when you select a different aspect ratio than the native, so I've selected 16 by 9, it does actually change the resolution as well. It just automatically switches over to one of the 16 by 9 resolutions. So this is 2560 by 1440 or 1440p it's switched over to. And you can see that fill up looks quite horrible. It's all stretched and distorted and weird. I don't really think anyone's going to be wanting to use that. It's more likely with this QHD or 1440p resolution that you're going to want to select equivalent or pixel by pixel. So equivalent should make things undistorted, but you can see it doesn't. It seems to be the same as fill. Can depend on the resolution, but for this particular one it doesn't seem to work properly. So it should really be using up as many pixels as it can without upsetting the aspect ratio selected for the source resolution, so 16 by 9. It shouldn't be stretched like this. Pixel by pixel, that's the pixel mapping feature. You would expect that to have a big black box around the image, and indeed it does. So this only uses 2560 by 1440 pixels. There's some weird scaling used, which is why things look massive. That's Windows' fault, it's not the monitor's fault. That's better. So this is with 100%, so no scaling. It was at 200% before. So yeah, it's certainly usable. You get those black borders. With it being an OLED, the black borders are nice and black, at least if there's not too much brightness in the room. Something to be aware of though, this is with 60 Hz, but that's what it selected for me when I selected 16:9 in the OSD. If you select 120 Hz, it seems to do something a bit different. So it seems to have overscanned. So you see the image runs off. So it's not fitting it properly. It actually looks like it's 21:9 with this 16:9 resolution selected, which is strange. And you can see in the OSD it says 3840 by 2160. So the monitor doesn't actually support scaling for 120 Hz QHD. That's what I get from this. However, if you select 144 Hz, which is difficult when you can't see the apply button, I just pressed Alt F4, then it says, do you want to apply the settings? And I can press yes, thankfully, so I didn't need to find the apply button. Anyway, this works just fine. It's correctly scaled, 1:1 pixel mapping, and the OSD says 5120 by 1440, 144 Hz. Well, that's interesting. So I don't know why it reports that in the OSD. It is the monitor scaling, it isn't my GPU scaling, so it does work properly, but not at 120 Hz. The other thing you might have noticed when I was using these settings, you can't use VRR at the same time. It's killed G-Sync compatible, in other words. And variable refresh rate is grayed out. There are a few other settings which you can't use. You can't use PIP P by P either. And I think it destroyed the Type-C or the KVM functionality as well. It does actually tell you what it disables when you first activate it. So when I switch to another aspect ratio, I'll be able to show you a list of exactly what it disables. So let's do that now. 21:9 full. Let's see what it does. So this is filling the entire screen up, as it should be doing. And I believe it selected 3440 by 1440. Indeed it has, at 60 Hz. There's the equivalent setting. And it's just showing you that it disables PIP, variable refresh rate, and ELMB/ELMB sync, although this monitor doesn't actually have ELMB or ELMB sync, being QD OLED. So that's irrelevant, but, you know, disables the things I said it would disable. But anyway, equivalent fills up the entire screen, which it shouldn't technically do. It should be the same as the aspect setting on some other monitors. But pixel by pixel will hopefully give me some black borders at the sides, yes. So that is the correct 3440 by 1440 representation. Now let's switch over to 120 Hz and see what happens. It again seems to have overscanned. So it's not showing it correctly. And it says 3840 by 2160. So it doesn't seem to like to scale at 120 Hz for whatever reason. So yes, indeed, 3840 by 2160 is a 4K UHD downsampling mode, which the monitor does support at up to 120 Hz, but that does not match the resolution I've selected, or the monitor selected, 3440 by 1440. However, if I select 144 Hz, Alt F4, yes. Then it represents it correctly, 3440 by 1440, black borders at the sides, no distortion. Next you've got blue light filter, increasing effect, level 1 being the slowest. Why does it bother telling me that ELMB is going to be disabled? It doesn't even exist on this monitor. Seriously, ASUS, come on. And level 2 is a stronger effect. Level 3 stronger again, level 4 stronger again. That also locks off your brightness control and minimizes the brightness, because reducing brightness does indeed reduce the blue light you're exposed to, because it reduces all light you're exposed to from the monitor. These are quite effective, especially level 3 and level 4, but yes, even if you don't reduce the brightness to incredibly low levels, they're still effective. But it also imparts a green tint to the image because it retains a quite strong green channel. So if you want to use low blue light, very effective low blue light setting, which I feel is visually better balanced, set the color temperature, or color temp, to 4000K. And this is a highly effective low blue light setting. It reduces blue light output from the screen significantly. It also reduces the green channel somewhat and maintains a good strong red channel. So this gives a kind of amber tint to the image, which I find my eyes will adjust to quite readily compared to the green or greenish yellow tint that the other low blue light settings at stronger levels give. So you might like to use this to give a more relaxing look to the image. And there are other settings available. So 5000K would be a milder low blue light setting, but still reasonably effective. 6500K being closer to the defaults. Actually, the default would be user with everything set to 100, or the default with racing mode on this monitor. 6500K on my unit was very similar, just that the 6500K setting had a very slightly stronger green channel, but they were both pretty neutral in that respect anyway, with user technically being just slightly better balanced. Or if you want a cool tint, there's 7500K, 8200K, 9300K, and an incredible 10000K, which I like to call Igloo Vision. Next, you've got 6-axis saturation. Again, that's only available in certain presets, so I'm going to have to switch back over to user. Some of the others probably have it as well, but I'm not sure exactly which ones do and don't. I just know user does. So this allows you to adjust the red, green, and blue color channels individually, as well as cyan, magenta, and yellow for the saturation levels. So if you want to fine-tune saturation, you can do that. What I would say is if you start reducing these, you might notice that some shades remain quite saturated and others start to become rather undersaturated. It's very difficult to get the balance right, even with 6-axis control. So if you do want to control saturation, as I mentioned before, there are different gamut settings, so I'd recommend trying that first. If you want to fine-tune things with the 6-axis, then by all means give it a go. Different gamma settings as well. 2.2 is the default, as 1.8, 2.0, 2.4, 2.6 as alternatives. Input auto detection. So that will mean the monitor will automatically select the input for you. If you want to manually select the input, you'll see that it has USB Type-C and HDMI grayed out. That's because I only have something connected via DisplayPort. If you turn that off, you can manually select the input, as you can see, even if nothing's connected or nothing's in use. PIP P by P, that's grayed out because I have a variable refresh rate active. Variable refresh rate is grayed out as well. That's a curious one. So maybe uniform brightness, I don't know why that was disabled. I prefer that enabled. It's because I changed the resolution and everything, but I had left aspect control enabled, even though it wasn't doing anything useful for me. So make sure that is set if you want it to just use the native resolution to 32:9 full. That's the default setting, and that will allow you to activate the settings correctly. So you'll see PIP P by P is now available, and variable refresh rate is disabled. Again, if I enabled that, then PIP P by P would disappear. So PIP/P by P, picture in picture, picture by picture. Various different options here, quite good flexibility. I'm not going to go through all of these. I have only got one source selected, so it's going to be a little bit dull. I'll just show you some of the standard ones and a few interesting additions they have here. So this gives you your secondary source, which in my case is the same as my primary source, so it just duplicated the image in a little box towards the top right, and the rest of the image is for my main source. You can swap the sources over, primary and secondary, with this function. You can change the preset used for the sub-source, so it's different to the primary source. You can change the size of the box, so there's large and small. And just as a reminder, that's the middle setting. So this option here is picture by picture. So that gives you your usual left and right, primary source and your secondary source together on the screen. And each of those, by default at least, is a scaled up 2560 by 1440. It sets it to 60 Hertz. I wonder if you can increase the refresh rate. See, I'm learning at the same time because I haven't really played with this. So no, it is actually limited to 60 Hertz. But just as a reminder, if you're using picture in picture, there's no such restriction. So it's setting back to my 5120 by 1440, 144 Hertz for my primary source. But I'm not sure if the secondary source is restricted. I've only got one system connected, so I'm afraid I can't tell you that. But I mentioned the interesting option, so these are the last two here. So this is a picture by picture setting, and it will give you 3440 by 1440 for your main source. And you'll see that there, 3440 by 1440 at 60 Hertz. Yes, I think it's restricted to 60 Hertz. I will double check that. Then your secondary source uses the remainder of the screen. And yes, unfortunately it is restricted to 60 Hertz. That's a list of things that are disabled. Sorry if you didn't catch that, but that was a list of things that are disabled when you're using PIP P/P. Again, listed ELMB as if it's actually on this monitor, but it's not. But it did say variable refresh rate and ASCR, which is also not on this monitor. Next, you've got the lighting feature of the monitor. It's called Aura Sync if you're using software to control it. You have to have that set to off to activate Aura RGB, which means you're using the OSD to control it. So there are various different options. I'm just going to show you a few of these. I'm not going to go through all of it because it's not a particularly interesting feature for most people, and that's because most people will be in front of the monitor. The lighting feature is not particularly bright. It's at the back of the screen. You can only actually appreciate it from the back of the screen. It is quite pretty looking, I have to say, but again, you can only see it from the back. And it's just that little eye logo there, so that's the rainbow effect. There's also color cycle, which just goes through various different colors. The difference with rainbow was that not all of the eye transitioned at the same time. So that's the ROG logo, by the way, if you're not familiar. The Republic of Gamers logo, which is also shown at the top right there. You can have a static colour selection: red, green, blue, cyan, magenta and yellow. Let's just see yellow. To the eye, that did look more yellow than it appeared on the camera preview screen. And there's the same thing, but there's a breathing effect and a strobing effect. You get the idea. My phone just interrupted me there with a little message from Amazon saying, "We thought you'd like a new monitor." I'm quite happy with this one at the moment, actually. I'm quite enjoying reviewing it, so get lost, Amazon. There's then My Favourite, which I've been through, and System Setups. You can change the language that the OSD is displayed in. Sound, so you can change the volume or mute anything connected to the 3.5mm jack. You'll see sound sources grayed out. That's because you can't select between a jack and speakers because this monitor doesn't have speakers. Or maybe sound sources, something to do with PIP P/P, but I apologise if I've given you the wrong information there. But either way, the monitor doesn't have integrated speakers, but you can choose sound output, headphone or SPDIF, or SPDIF if you prefer to call it that. Next is USB setup. So this allows you to control the KVM functionality of the monitor. So for this, you can just select USB-C or USB-B if you prefer to do it that way. Or you can activate Smart KVM. And this seems to have a picture-by-picture functionality integrated with it. Unfortunately, I can't really test this out, as again, I only have one system connected. Now, I have disabled Smart KVM, but it seems to still have picture-in-picture or picture-by-picture active. Just disable that. I will revisit KVM, by the way. I know it is something that people do like to use, so I will talk a little bit more about it when I'm talking about the DisplayWidget Center software, which really you're supposed to use to configure this. Power indicator, so that little, quite faint power LED just at the bottom there. If that's annoying you, you can disable it. Power key lock if you want to make it so you can't accidentally press the power button. If you do press the power button, by the way, it doesn't just go off straight away. It actually says power turn off, turn on. So it already has a little integrated measure to stop you accidentally pressing it and turning the monitor off straight away, which some people will like, other people will find a little bit annoying because it's another step to turn the power off to the monitor. Don't know why I worded that so strangely, to turn off the monitor. Key lock. Check quick start guide to cancel this function. There we are. The key is unlocked. I just held the joystick in the down direction for a little while. I think it was 10 seconds possibly. I'm not sure, I wasn't really counting. Power setting allows you to activate power saving mode, which will restrict certain settings, just uses less power or forces you to use less power. You can use less power by reducing the brightness of the monitor. That's really the main thing, and not using HDR and being really boring. OSD setup, you can change the position of the OSD, how long after the last button pressed before it automatically disappears. Set that between 10 and 120 seconds. Transparency, change the transparency level. There's DDC/CI, which allows you to use certain software, such as DisplayWidget Center, to control the monitor. Next is screen protection. Screensaver, what that will do is it will dim the screen after a few minutes of inactivity, or it may not dim the screen, it depends what brightness setting you're actually using in the first place, but for most people it will be dimming the screen. These screen protection features, as the name implies, because this is an OLED screen, these are really just designed to help mitigate image retention. Think of it as sort of hygiene for the monitor. It's just something you have to consider with OLED models like this. Pixel cleaning. This will run certain voltages through the monitor to refresh its pixels, or clean its pixels, as it says. It is something which has to be run manually as far as I can tell on this model. So that's how you do this. You press yes to execute it. It takes about 6 minutes to complete, and this little power LED will flash amber quite rapidly when it's running its cleaning cycle. Pixel cleaning reminder. So what that does is it gives you a message towards the bottom right of the screen after 2 hours, 4 hours, or 8 hours of use to remind you to run the pixel cleaning cycle. And then you can select yes on the message, or you can select no, or you can just ignore the message. It disappears after around 10 seconds anyway, so it doesn't stay on the screen for long. What I would suggest is just run the pixel cleaning cycle when you're not going to be using the monitor for a little bit. So say you're making a meal or having a meal away from the monitor, perhaps at lunchtime, run it then. If you're using the monitor in the afternoon as well, perhaps run it for the evening meal. It really just depends how much you're going to be using the monitor, to be honest. Just work out a schedule that works for you, but I would generally recommend after 8 hours of using the monitor, try to run the pixel cleaning cycle. You can also run it before going to bed or before turning the monitor off and turning your system off. But to do that, be aware the monitor does actually have to be given a signal, otherwise you can't run the pixel cleaning cycle. So you'd have to run the pixel cleaning cycle, then perhaps press the power button on your PC to shut it down, for example. That would work. But if you do forget to run this sometimes, don't beat yourself up too much. You can also run it manually if you notice a bit of image retention to try and get rid of that. Should just be temporary image retention. It should hopefully clear off when you've run the pixel cleaning cycle. I prefer monitors which automatically run a cycle when the monitor goes in standby or turns off if it needs to be run. That is a better way of doing it. ASUS seems to do it manually here, and they did it manually on the PG27AQDM I used as well. Screen move, and this will just nudge the screen a little bit. So there's a small border around the image, which really just blends into the bezel, so it's difficult to see anyway. That allows the pixels to just move around in that border, so you don't lose any of the image. It just displays itself up, down, left or right with this screen move feature every now and then. If you find that annoying, you could disable it, turn it off, or you can have it slow so it doesn't do it as often or as much, or fast if you're happy to do it quite often. It's just another mitigation measure. It will just help reduce the chance of image retention or potentially burn-in at the edges or of a fine object. Adjust logo brightness. If I'm not mistaken, this isn't available if you have variable refresh rate active. So yes, it's grayed out now, but what that does is it will dim static elements of the image, or that's what it's designed to do. But it's not just logos it's going to affect. It will affect little HUD elements in games and affect icons, stuff like that. So for consistency, I generally prefer this disabled. But really, with all of these settings, I would just recommend enabling them, leaving them enabled, and if they're annoying you, then disable them one by one. I'd also recommend that you use Windows Power Management to turn the display off if you're not using it after a few minutes. Because the screensaver is good, but it doesn't turn the screen off completely, it just dims the screen. So you might as well have the screen off when you're not using it. But the screensaver feature's neat in that it will activate if you're in a game or you're watching a movie and the game's paused and the movie's paused. Small movements like the mouse moving just a tiny bit, a cursor blinking, the clock changing on the desktop, that won't stop the screensaver from activating, so it ignores that kind of thing. But any larger movements, or when you're actually using the monitor, will stop it activating, which is a good thing. Next, you've got DisplayPort Stream. So DisplayPort 1.4 for the full functionality. If you need to reduce that for compatibility or any other reason, then DisplayPort 1.2. Also a compatibility feature or something you might want to do if you're that way inclined, you can disable DSC. If you do that, then you won't be able to leverage the full capabilities of the monitor. But again, you have the option to do that here. Some information about the monitor next. Tells you a bit about the signal which it's currently receiving. And also the firmware version. Mine's using MCM003, which was the newest at the time of review. And all reset, which will allow you to reset everything to the factory defaults. And we'll recenter that crosshair for you as well. So next I'm going to show you ASUS DisplayWidget Center. There's a link to download that in the description of the video. You don't need a USB cable connected to use this software. So I'm not going to run through absolutely everything here. You can see it in the video, various different things you can control, such as brightness, contrast. There's variable OD, that shouldn't be here. This is an OLED screen, it doesn't have overdrive, and it doesn't have any effect at all if you adjust this. blue light filter settings, so you can quickly activate or change the low blue light setting. Shadow boost, notice there's not a dynamic adjustment mode, although there was in the OSD. ASCR isn't applicable to this monitor. It's an OLED, doesn't need such a crappy feature. These are grayed out because of the preset I'm using, but if I switch to user, you'll be able to see the 6-axis saturation control that you can adjust. I apologise, a saturation slider which you can adjust, and a hue slider as well, which isn't a feature on this monitor actually, so again it doesn't do anything. And for that matter, neither does the saturation slider. No, they don't do anything. And ASCR is actually available in the user setting, at least it seems to be on the software, but again it doesn't do anything. But if you change things that do have an effect like brightness, it's very quick. You can see that on the video. And if you make a change here, so let's say I slide it all the way down to 0, and you then hold the compare button, it goes back up to where it was before. You release compare, goes to your new value, so that just allows you to quickly compare the two. Next is Game Plus, pretty self-explanatory. You've got your different crosshair designs there. Again, there's not a dynamic crosshair mode or whatever they called it, so you can't set that here, but you can do that in the OSD. You can change the position of the Game Plus feature, and the same with the timer, the FPS counter, display alignment, that just helps you line up multiple monitors. I don't believe I showed you that on the OSD. I can't even recall seeing it. I apologise that I skipped over that, but it really is just what I showed you and told you about. OLED setup, so these are the OLED care options, which I talked about just before. And also the uniform brightness setting, which I talked about before. You can enable and disable that here. These do say on, by the way. I know it's difficult to see because of the exposure of the camera. There we go. Target mode, that wasn't something which was available in the OSD. It seems to require the software to do this, but that just means it will dim the screen except for active elements, so the taskbar is active. This window, if I click it, becomes active. So if you don't mind how that looks, then it could be worth just keeping it on. Personally, I find it a bit annoying. And there's also the pixel cleaning cycle reminder and the screen move setting. Next, you've got system settings, and this allows you to toggle HDR on and off, which is a feature to auto hide the taskbar. It's a Windows feature, but as is HDR, you can just toggle them here conveniently. And change the background color scheme as well. And you can enable power saving mode, which was a feature in the OSD. Next, you've got multi-screen. There's multi-frame, PIP, P/P, and KVM. So multi-frame, that is just allowing you to snap windows to different positions. But I'm not sure how you actually do this. I pressed apply and I can't see anything showing my snap positions. Windows 11 has pretty good functionality for that anyway. PIP, P/P, so the settings for that there. And KVM. So again, you can activate Smart KVM. But unfortunately, I don't have anything else connected, as I said before. And to be completely honest, this feature is very, very low down my priority list when I'm testing things on monitors. So don't want to spend too much time on this, but yes, it does have KVM functionality. You can also set up a hotkey which will allow you to use the KVM switch. So just as a quick reminder, or if you're not familiar, KVM allows you to have USB-B and USB-C upstream ports connected. So you've got two different systems connected with data transfer via USB, and then you can switch out peripherals that are connected to the monitor to the downstream port between using the USB-C system and the USB-B system. And the Smart KVM functionality, I assume this is how the monitor or the software determines which screen is connected to which port, or perhaps it just assumes that USB-C is used for everything. I'm not sure, because with Gigabyte models and a few others I've used, you can actually say USB-B has a system connected via HDMI, for example, and USB-C has a system connected via USB-C or via DisplayPort. It will switch the display input at the same time as reassigning the peripherals. So I don't know how it works on this, and I can't test it out as I only have one system. And then there are application settings. So just a few things here. You can select if you want the application to automatically update. That's not for the firmware of the monitor, by the way, it's just for the application. And if an update's available, it'll tell you, and you can just press update. And you can change to standard mode rather than gaming or auto, depends on monitor, is gaming in this case. And information log for service use only, you can download that. And if you've got multiple ASUS monitors connected, you can select another one to control that instead. So that is all there is to the OSD on-screen display menu system of the ASUS ROG Swift OLED PG49WCD. Be sure to check out the full review, which is linked to in the video description. There's also information about how you can support the work that we do there. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support.